Welcome to GovExperts Insights, where we talk about politics, policy, and the practice of both. We're here with Jessica Melugin today, and we'll be discussing the public policy surrounding antitrust and competition. Jessica is the director of the Center for Technology and Innovation at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Her research focuses on technology issues including antitrust, online privacy, artificial intelligence, telecommunications, social media content, and net neutrality regulation. Her writings have appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, USA Today, Bloomberg Law, National Review, and others. She's been cited in the Washington Post, Politico, U.S. News and World Report, and Variety. She is the 2022 and 2023 Innovators Network Foundation Antitrust and Competition Policy Fellow. Jessica graduated magna cum laude from Claremont McKenna College with a degree in government and art history. She lives in Virginia's horse country with her children. Jessica, welcome to GovExperts Insights.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what got you interested in antitrust and competition. This was an interest of yours going all the way back to college, wasn't it?
Yeah, I guess I was always a dork, I think is the top line on that, I guess, right? What interests college students in antitrust law? Well, we may never know. But there it was. In my defense, when I was in college, the big Microsoft antitrust trial was going on. So at least it was sort of in the news if you were a college student who read the news. And I became fascinated about it because it is sort of the intersection of law and economics. And Microsoft, was a great American success story. So it was interesting to see in real time the government going after that company.
Well, and it is. And it's interesting, too, to look back at those companies that have been targeted on antitrust and what's happened to them since then. Standard Oil was broken up and obviously, manifested itself. And then now they come back together. AT&T, and the Bell Network, similar. Microsoft, a little bit, not doing poorly today.
Yeah, so Microsoft's came through it okay. But when you look back at the history of a lot of the sort of the more mainstream antitrust cases that I think, as I call normal people might have heard of and know about, it kind of does point you to some fundamental questions about our competition law here in the U.S. By the time the Standard Oil Trust was taken to trial, their prices for consumers have been consistently falling. And people also, as you mentioned, like to point to the AT&T breakup. But of course, who built AT&T as a monopoly? The government did, right? For a long time, the Federal Communications Commission and AT&T were kind of like one melted blob together. So when people talk about the big breakup, I say it's no big surprise that ushered in a lot of innovation because the government built and maintained that monopoly for decades. We would have had a lot more of what we saw after the breakup a lot sooner if that hadn't happened. And then there's, of course, the famous IBM case, which I think was in court for 13 years before the Reagan administration basically said it was without merit and dropped it. So antitrust in the U.S. has had a stormy and tumultuous history, and I think it's for good reason. When I studied the Microsoft trial, I talked a lot about that. Is this really anything different because it's a new technology, or are we still sort of facing the same challenges with antitrust law? And that's certainly a relevant question today as well when we see all our big tech companies in court defending themselves against the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice.
So what was your first job out of college?
I promise everyone I've had other jobs since, but I have to admit my first job out of college was here at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I was an intern while all of my cooler friends were in Europe having adventures on their semester abroad. I said, I'd really like to go to DC and work at a think tank for a semester and take classes at night. I warned everyone at the top, this is going to be a dorky tale, but it's true. And then when I graduated, I realized I really enjoyed my time at a think tank, and I loved learning about this stuff and thinking about it, talking about it, and applying it to what I think are sort of timeless principles of economic freedom and a lot of innovation that's benefited humanity. So I took some time off to be with my kids when they were little, but now I'm back and, still enjoying it in the same way. That's one of the blessings of my job, is that you get to keep learning every day. So very lucky to say, still here at CEI, back to where I started.
That's absolutely great and wonderful to have you back and continuing to engage. So you talked a little bit about this earlier, but I was thinking it might help folks if we before we get deeper into the discussion of antitrust, to talk about, you know, the antitrust and competition and the government's interest in it. You alluded to the fact that government kind of creates some of these monopolies, and we're going to talk about that a little bit in the discussion related to healthcare. But tell us a little bit about, I don't know where the best starting point is. Obviously, I think probably there with Standard Oil in the turn of the 1800s to 1900s, and coming to today, but maybe just a high level of what started it, the government's interest in it, and how has it evolved?
Yeah, I'll keep it at an interesting length for everyone. But what you need to know is that, around the rest of the world, this body of law is called competition law. And it's a little unusual that in the US we call it antitrust, even though, what that body of law deals with isn't always about trust busting anymore, right? But that's what was going on in the days of Standard Oil. So that's what it got called here today. And really, there was just sort of this concern that, gosh, these companies were so big, something nefarious must be going on. And it took our legal system a long time. The first, 60 or so years of antitrust was kind of a mess in terms of having like a guiding principle. Antitrust law couldn't really figure out, so are we worried about the competitors to big companies being treated unfairly? Are we worried about consumers being charged high prices because someone controls the whole market? And, at one point, a justice said in an opinion flat out, he said, the only thing I can discern about U.S. antitrust law is that the government always wins. Because if you don't really know where your North Star is, you're going to get some pretty messy decisions. And that's what we had. The best illustration, I think, of that is to say, to just do an everyday example, and that's bread. So, what if I was really niche high-end bread maker and I made everything organically and by hand, and to cover those costs I needed to charge $9 a loaf. I would run to the government and say, hey, this is really unfair that Wonder Bread over here is $1.99. I can't compete with them. This is unfair to me. They're so big and they have all the flour resources and they've mechanized, and what are you going to do? Now, if the government intervened in something like that, well, what could they do to fix that problem for a competitor? They would have to force Wonder Bread to raise their prices. And then that leads us back to, where the emphasis in antitrust law should be, and it should be on the consumer. So that might be great for our artisan bread creator, but it's not great for people who need to buy bread. Much better to let there be a range of prices and products, but always allow, big bread, as we'll call it, to do their thing too. Because of course, it's the lowest income people who need those options too. They need those efficiencies and lower prices that oftentimes economies of scale, so just a big company, can provide. So antitrust law in the US wrestled with that kind of question a lot. Who are we serving here? The competitors are the ones that come complaining, but who's looking out for consumers? And then in the 1970s, and sort of officially moved into the courts in the 80s under the Reagan administration, a lot of the people in this industry decided, okay, we're going to make this the point of antitrust law is consumer welfare. We call that the consumer welfare standard. And that took a lot of nonsense off the table, right? This isn't about protecting competitors. It's about protecting healthy competition in an effort to best serve consumers. So that doesn't always just mean high prices, like with our bread. That can also mean less output. That can also mean less innovation. But those are the things now we look at in a market when we're assessing, is there a problem here? Have the prices been coming up or going down? Have there been lots of innovations and changes and improvements that customers are enjoying? Is there more of this or less than this when this particular company we're looking at came on the scene? And those are good indications of healthy competition in a market. So that kind of cleaned up that revolution. And obviously, Judge Bork was a big part of that, but so were lots of people at the University of Chicago and even at Harvard. There was sort of this academic revolution in law and economics that said, we're going to make the consumer welfare standard the point here. And that got rid of a lot of rent seeking from competitors and a lot of government meddling that, as you alluded to earlier, even with the best of intentions, sometimes government can end up causing the same problem that it's trying to fix. We talked about the IBM case. And when the government started investigating IBM, what did IBM do? It raised its prices because it was worried it was going to get broke up and not be around long enough to recover and recoup people's investments. So the consumer welfare standard really protects against a lot of that nonsense, right? If consumers are being harmed, then we have a case, and then that's a real legitimate question to look at. But what we're seeing now in Washington is kind of a return to move away from that consumer welfare standard. So you have people like the chairwoman of the FTC, Lena Khan, and Eric Cantor, who's in charge of antitrust at the Department of Justice, saying, not so much with the consumer welfare standard. We have some other priorities here. And they really favor small businesses over large just for the sake that they're small and that, feels better to them. They're worried about competitors a little bit more than they're worried about consumers. And we can get into that and talk about that. But that's just a very 30,000 foot view of how antitrust has kind of started as a little mixed up, got itself straightened out. And now the policy fight we see in DC is to return to the old way of thinking or to preserve the consumer welfare standard.
That was a great century plus overview of where we started and where we're at. So I think that it's interesting that you used a grocery item as the example of things. And so, without getting too much into the presidential race and politics, do you have any point of view on the price gouging and within our food supply?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're seeing, this is sort of obviously this is niche policy stuff, antitrust, but you do see it pop up, right? Adjacent items or related items in the news. And I think the question about grocery prices and also gas, a lot of things like that, is relevant here. And so, the question people are really debating at a very high level and in sort of a casual way for those of us who are experts on it, is, what's responsible for these higher prices? Is it that a few companies in this concentrated market have enough control of supply that they're able to raise prices above what, we might think is a fair market price? And that's what we're seeing. Or are we seeing an actual reflection in their supply chain from inflationary factors? And this is what you expect and what you see across a lot of industries right now. I am inclined to say that the best way to check that is to ask, well, what's the competitive pressure for these companies? Do they have that kind of market power to say, we're going to up these prices and you're still going to pay, right? That's the question. And I think there's a FTC action right now to stop the merger of Kroger buying Albertsons. It's a $25 billion deal. It's obviously very big. So that's sort of put up the antenna of a lot of antitrust enforcers. So, right there, the first question is, well, are they monopolists? Do they have that kind of market power to act in a way that hurts consumers? And I think that in the court documents, you see that sort of how they define the market, which is the first thing you have to do. If you say someone has monopoly power, the question is, well, a monopoly of what? What market are we talking about? So that's a part of every antitrust case. You say, well, who could be a substitute for this? Who could be a competitor? And let's talk about what percentage the company we're looking at has as a market share in that context. And the fact that the government case for this, leaves out competitors, all the dollar stores, which in a lot of rural areas are where people do a decent amount of their grocery shopping. Those are not considered to be competitors, which I think doesn't really reflect the realities of how people live and shop for their groceries. Also left out is Amazon, which is, they're an innovative and relatively new force in all of this. But a lot of people living in suburban or urban areas order their groceries to be delivered from Whole Foods. And it also leaves out stores like Costco. And people, of course, do a lot of their grocery shopping there. And I think the market reality is there's a lot of pressure on grocery stores, and I don't think any grocery store could hike up their prices too far before people found alternatives. At least in the vast majority of cases. We can talk about places, they call them food deserts, where there's not a lot of competition. And so at a very local area, there might be those issues. But across the board, the question you look at and say, what's going on? Is this price gouging or is this inflation? one thing to look at is to say, well, would they be able to price gouge? Would they get away with that? Would people still shop there and pay that higher price? And I think when you see how dynamic and how competitive the grocery industry is with all those kind of players, when you really pull back the lens and look at where do people actually buy their food, and competitors like Aldi got also left out of that market definition. So I think, if you can narrow the lens enough, I use the example that, McDonald's has a monopoly on Big Macs. Yeah, they do. They're the only ones selling Big Macs. If you want a Big Mac, you got to pay their price. But if you pull the lens back a little bit and say, maybe you just want some kind of burger that day, or maybe you just want something for lunch that day, there obviously is competitive pressure on McDonald's to keep their Big Mac at a certain price, right? And I think we can kind of talk about it the same way in terms of the grocery store argument. These grocery stores, like every business in America, by the way, are out to make a profit. That's not the gotcha, when you read the emails of like they want to turn a profit. Yeah, they do. That anyone who's ever run a business can tell you that that's part of the plan. But there's these competitive pressures that keep that in check. And if you look at the profit margins for grocery stores, they're very slim, between 1% and 3%, I think is the number that goes around. And that just indicates to me that there might be something besides price gouging
it's a
going on
fascinating
there.
discussion in regards to that, especially when you look at those definitional variances that you and what's been left out of that comparison, because certainly you can pick and choose and make them look like the worst abusers on the planet and everything. But if you've left out such a large portion of the market, it kind of falls short when you look at it in total.
Yeah, and because we know this, like the fascinating part of economics is like it's about how we live and the choices we make, how we behave. So everybody buys groceries, and if you don't, I'd love to hear how you figured out how to get out of that, because I would love to not have to go to the grocery store. But it's a pretty universal experience. So if you saw your grocery prices going way up and thought that's weird, let me go check this other store. And again, this isn't the same for places that are really isolated and have only one option. And there are a handful of examples of that, I fully acknowledge. But for most Americans, they have a lot of choice, and they're very capable of hopping online and price checking or driving down the block and checking the grocery store there. And to think that, a grocery store chain could just maintain those high prices without any effect of losing business, I think is not a real reflection of how consumers behave.
Well, staying with kind of the grocery store theme in regards to this, you mentioned Amazon. Obviously, they acquired Whole Foods. In our one of our groceries of preference here in Texas is HEB.
Yes.
And I was in some of their newer stores recently, and just the amount of innovation that is occurring within the store, especially with apps like Favor, with the delivery apps, DoorDash, Uber Eats, other things there's a lot of technological innovation that is impacting how we shop for and how we receive our groceries.
That's exactly right. And that's what we were talking about, how, the price point isn't the only indicator of a healthy market, right? Some of that is innovation. And I think one really cool thing that Amazon and Whole Foods entering that marketplace did was it pushed traditional retailers to start offering what they could too, about home delivery or curbside pickup, all those things. So when you look at that grocery industry, do you really see sort of a stagnation in innovation? Because if they were a monopolist, that's how you would expect them to act, right? Like if they've got it and they don't need to do anything to keep their customers happy, you'd expect to see them hike their prices, and you'd expect them not to bother innovating. It's expensive for them to innovate and change and institute new systems and think of new ideas. But you see a ton of that in this industry. COVID accelerated some of that, I think. But the point is, it's really, you see a lot of healthy competition, right? I think it's, and obviously HEB is a wonderful grocery store. We don't have them where I live, but I have been to them, and they're shockingly impressive. But they've probably been like that from the beginning. And now you can get it delivered to your house, and you can get it put in your car when you pull up to the curb, and a lot of other things. So I just don't think that market is a great candidate for saying, oh, someone's got too much monopoly power and consumers aren't being served. I think that prices are higher in grocery stores right now, and people are rightly concerned with that. But I'm not sure that the monopoly or the antitrust solution is one that makes much sense.
So it's interesting when we started talking about price gouging. Obviously, I'm most familiar with that at the state level, particularly in times of disaster. Otherwise, I think COVID kind of challenged that, broadened it a little bit. Now we've got it talking about in the national in the presidential debate. But it does kind of show you kind of some of the things that are going on at the state level. And obviously, there's a lot of antitrust litigation that has emanated from the states and the state's attorney general. It's a federal, prerogative. And so what I wanted to just kind of explore a little bit with you is the interest of the states versus the federal government in antitrust and competition, because it certainly seems like, there's a competition there as well as collaboration at times. But if you're a company out there looking for certainty, if you're a company worried about risk, you've got a lot to worry about.
Yeah, you have layers of worry. So I think there's a lot of things happening with that question. To start it off lightly, I will say that in public, I have sort of jokingly, but if anyone ever took me up on it, I would probably do it. Offered whenever I have state antitrust enforcers in the room, I say, standing offer from the Competitive Enterprise Institute. If you will tell your staff to stop working on state antitrust efforts, we will send you a game console of your choice, and all the hours that you would spend harassing your companies in state, you can enjoy yourselves on video games. No one's taken me up on it, but the offer stands. And this is why, and we touched on it a little bit, this kind of use of antitrust to protect competitors instead of competition invites so much rent seeking. It invites so many companies that can't compete in the marketplace to say, well, what if I got government on my side and put a little pressure on the guy out in the lead? And that's not always the case, but that's the case a lot. And to sort through those kinds of concerns and find the real antitrust problems takes an enormous amount of resources, right? These are complex economic calculations that every state office doesn't have. And they have a lot of, real crime that they're responsible for dealing with too. So, I tend to be a little skeptical of the state action. Also, it has become lately so politicized. I think it's a great way for a state attorney general, not thinking of anyone in particular here, to get in the headlines, to be tough on whatever. And, when they're tough on crime or they're tough on other things, okay, that might be warranted. But when you're tough on your businesses, or worse yet, tough on some other states' businesses, I think that a lot of times that's more political hay than it is really serving the residents of your state. Again, not always the case, but to me, just laying on, what antitrust is regulatory action. And U.S. businesses are already overfaced with regulation. So to me, that's just another layer of that. And that's separate from, obviously, if there's fraud going on, that's illegal and should be immediately dealt with. But we're talking about really nuanced questions of, did your competitor gain that advantage because they're doing it better or through some illegal means? I mean, this is complex stuff. And I think that can get politicized pretty quickly at the state and the national level. I mean, not picking on the states. We're kind of seeing that at every level. And I, if I was a business that wanted to innovate and compete fiercely and that benefited consumers, I might be thinking twice about the moves I made. And, that's not the message we want to be sending to America's entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I understand. So, both federal and state laws are getting a lot more attention these days, especially with an active FTC chair and multiple high-profile antitrust actions that we just discussed. What are some of the biggest antitrust cases in like the tech space, big tech, and why should people be paying attention to them?
Yeah, so Google has a couple. There's a search case that was just decided it's going to be appealed, but that found that Google had a monopoly in general search. So that's, again, one of these sort of market classifications that the government put forward that I think leaves out a lot of real world search. So much of search now actually originates on Amazon and happens in social media apps and other things. So, we'll see what happens with that case. And actually in that one, the government's been asked to come up with so what do you want us to do? What's the remedy? And they really haven't been able to answer that question. I think that's a red flag for anyone who says, maybe what's happening here is that Google is just really good at providing search. They sure are. And they're really big and they have a high market share. But just to remind everyone, having a monopoly market share isn't illegal. Getting that market share in an illegal way is problematic, or maintaining it. But if you're really making a superior product, and by the way, it happens to be free, you would think it would be a little harder to prove consumer harm there. But we'll see what happens on appeal. The other Google case is an ad tech case, and I will not subject your lovely listeners to the technicalities of how ads are purchased and sold online. It's a complex process. It's a two-sided market, as we talk about, where it's sort of bringing two groups together, people who want to sell space on their websites and people who want to buy advertising on those sites. And the government is concerned because Google plays a large role in that entire ecosystem. But again, if you look at, what's going on with online advertising? And what's going on is it's cheaper than it was. It's more prevalent than it was, and it's better. It's more accurately targeted to people who want to see it. And the reality is it's been a huge boon for the people who use it, right? Small businesses can use it very easily and relatively affordably. And it's really allowed small companies that might not have the big advertising budgets that would have been needed before online advertising to increase their scale.
That's what I was going to ask. Does the consumer believe that they've been harmed?
I mean, I think that trial just got started. We'll be into that for a couple weeks, but I think the government has an uphill battle because they're going to have to prove that even though it's gotten less expensive to run those ads, it theoretically would be even less expensive if it wasn't Google, it was someone else. And I suppose you could say that they feel that builds into down the line consumer prices for things. I think that's going to be a struggle. But again, we're moving through this weird time in antitrust where the authorities at the DOJ and the FTC are really trying to expand the boundaries of what antitrust can call into question. And they're moving away from that consumer welfare standard. So what they're going to introduce is like a lot of competitors to Google who say, they're too big to beat. We can't deal with them. And, to that, I would just say, right, but how's it working out for me? Like, I'm the consumer. How's it going for me? I'm sorry for your business. I wouldn't want to compete against Google either. But you still have to do it on the merits. And I think one thing, that maybe Google has going for it is that hopefully it can include in the discussion, what artificial intelligence might mean for all of these questions. Because it's one thing to say nobody can catch Google, nobody can compete with Google, which I don't agree with. But I'll tell you what, there's a lot of entrepreneurs and innovators out there who are going to try to figure out how to use AI to do just that. And I wouldn't be sleeping too soundly if I was in charge of all those Google products. I wouldn't be thinking, we got it on lock. It's just, it's running itself these days. I don't think that's really the reality. There's an old case against Meta that's been going on for years. And it actually is about before Meta was called Meta and it was still called Facebook. It bought Instagram. Now, when it bought Instagram, there were late night talk show jokes about how much Facebook paid for Instagram. People thought it was absurd. I think it was $1 billion. And they just couldn't believe it. That's so ridiculous. What's this dumb thing where people put pictures of their cats up there and who's going to want that? And it was kind of this buggy app that didn't really have that many subscribers and people thought they were crazy. Well, then Facebook, which would become Meta, put a whole lot of resources into making that app now one of the most popular applications in the US. And again, it's free. It's facilitated a ton of advertising for small businesses and people love it. I mean, if you go by who uses it, people love it. So, again, I asked the question, where's the consumer harm? And again, we come back in that trial to them leaving off sort of a lot of the competition that's out there and how quickly where's the barrier to entry for someone thinking up the next social media app? So since that case was filed till now, TikTok has been born, which, was the fastest growing social media app. So again, government is going to have a hard time saying consumers have been hurt or there isn't competition in this space, because certainly Meta is a huge company and has scale, but they also do a great job with Instagram. People really like it. And there's anyone can roll out their new social media platform, as candidate and former President Trump can tell you. It's hard to do. It's hard to do well, but that's the marketplace. Anyone can do it. So there's that one going on. And then there's an Amazon case where the FTC alleges that Amazon's not really playing fairly with their terms for their third-party sellers. So if you go on Amazon, you can buy Amazon products. So those are kind of like generic, the equivalent of supermarket generics. Or you can go to the marketplace and you can buy from a host of small sellers around the country and probably around the globe. And they're saying that, they don't really like how Amazon has what the terms are with those sellers in Amazon. That's really what's at the heart of that case. I would argue those are private agreements, and if sellers don't like that, they don't have to sell there. But the cool thing about Amazon, and in terms again of consumers in the bigger picture, the last big retailer we had was Walmart, still bigger than Amazon, by the way. And when they came on the scene, there was a lot of discomfort and outcry because people said, this Walmart moved in at the end of town and now there's no Main Street. These Main Street shops are gone. And I think that was really difficult, that kind of churn. While I think overall there's efficiency and price benefits, and I'm all for Walmart, but I think that there's like a real cost to that of those owners or people who just prefer small places. And I think that's a difficult creative destruction moment. And we kind of had to deal with that when a Walmart came on the scene. I think Walmart kind of escaped a lot of ire on that at a federal regulatory level because they were kind of started in the flyover states. I think if it were happening on the coast and you had sort of the media elite squawking about it, things might have been different. That's just my theory. But the point is, there was a lot of benefit, especially for people in need of those better prices. And there was certainly a lot of variety of products that brought to communities and jobs and a lot of good things. I'm pro Walmart, but there was a real trade-off there. And the cool thing about the Amazon marketplace is they've kind of like rejuvenated small retail, right? Because if I want to start a little niche shop, I don't have to go to downtown Main Street and fight with Walmart and pay a lease and do all those things. I can start it in my garage and I can sell on Amazon. And I get all the big scale and scope and reach. And if I want delivery services of Amazon, even as a little guy, right? It's kind of just this really cool merging of like small business acumen and the scale of big businesses. And I think it kind of, pains me that instead of celebrating that cool innovation, we're going after Amazon because some regulators don't like the terms, And again, they will have to prove that those terms eventually lead to consumer harm. We'll see how successful they are at that.
So when you talk about the erosion of the consumer welfare standard, I mean, that's obviously one example trying to catch those small businesses that are impacted there. What are some other categories of how the consumer welfare standard is being eroded or expanded?
Yeah, we're just moving away from it, and we're taking, I think the FTC and the DOJ would, and I want to try to, respectfully represent what they would say. They would say there's other concerns, right? That the price isn't the only thing. There's other things we should be concerned about in keeping a healthy economy and a healthy society. I think my bias is I don't really trust bureaucrats to know any better about how society should unfold than people who actually have skin in the game. But I think that's what they would say. I don't doubt that they have good intentions at all. But when the problem is that it's sort of like you can only serve one master. So, just like the bread example, once you throw over the consumer welfare, right? Once you raise the prices on consumers because you're protecting a competitor, you kind of have to make a choice. And that's what U.S. antitrust law struggled with for a long time. It said, well, can't we help these little guys? And, and we really kind of learned the hard way. You can't, right? If you're gonna, you have to serve one master, and it should be the consumer. So, we see that a little bit in a lot of these cases because people love Google search. The number one searched word on Microsoft's preloaded search tool, which is Bing. Like if you buy a Microsoft laptop product and it comes with Bing, the number one search thing on that is Google, so that people can change their search default to Google. That I think tells us something about, okay, so the DOJ is going to come in and what are they going to do? Break up Google search? You're going to get you risk destroying a lot of the efficiencies and a lot of the great services. And as per usual, Europe has been kind enough to run this experiment for us and recently mandated choice screens. So, when you buy an Apple phone in the US, you pull out your Apple phone and it has a bunch of defaults on it. And if you don't like them, it takes about 3 clicks to change them and it's free. You can change it to whatever you want. But if you don't want to deal with it and you're happy with the defaults, it's pretty convenient. But in Europe, they said, no, that's not really fair to all the search products trying to compete. So we're going to have a choice screen that pops up. So they did that. And then what happened? The Google search market shares didn't change at all. People picked exactly that same default. So, I'm hoping in the US we can take advantage of that, those European lab results to say, maybe we should stay out of these decisions. And if this is serving consumers and this seems to be what consumers want, let's leave it alone. So I think the Google search question is one example of that. Blocking grocery store mergers, I think, if these grocery stores are merging so they can scale up and be more efficient, and I think possibly, at least theoretically, offer lower prices to people, then we have to accept that preventing that from happening necessarily means higher prices for consumers. If we move away from that consumer welfare standard, what are we doing here? And the FTC has been pretty explicit about saying, they want to incorporate other things besides that consumer welfare standard, like labor concerns, or, did these companies have too much influence on society in other ways that are really difficult to quantify and prove. And I think that once you get away from sort of the hard numbers of economic analysis, it's really helped antitrust be a better tool. Then you're moving into really murky and frankly politicized waters. And I don't think that ends up serving anyone. Everyone is their own special interest, but it's much better to let the marketplace work out those things than try to capture government favoritism for your own personal interest.
You mentioned the EU earlier and their approach to competition and antitrust laws. What would be the commiserate standard there, or comparable standard there to consumer welfare, or is there one? And have they already, you say by example and things, have they already expanded well beyond those types of things to where, you've got a lot more involvement by the EU regulators in businesses that are operating in Europe, well, and actually around the world, because I get questions here about, on things about European laws that technology-wise that we need to comply with. So,
yes, we've all been personally victimized by the accept cookies pop-up, and you can thank the EU for that. A completely pointless annoyance at every turn, I think, for all of us. So, yeah, the EU doesn't have a consumer welfare standard, and you can see how that's playing out in real time. They've already ordered, a lot of the things that Congress a couple years ago was considering doing here, and thankfully and wisely did not move on. The EU is now in the process of rolling out in practice, and that's they're one of the things is self-preferencing. So when you Google something here, you very well might see as your top results other Google products in an attempt to answer your query. So you might see a Google map, or, what's near me, all these kinds of tools that I, frankly are pretty useful. But in Europe, they said to Google, no, you're not allowed to do that. You're favoring your own search results. We won't allow that. And so they've sort of prevented those answers. And the reaction from European consumers has been frustration and confusion, because when you're walking around some new city you're visiting and you want, great pizza place near me, you kind of want that Google map to pop up next, right? You might want to see Yelp reviews, but you might want to see a Google map of where they are too, so you can walk over there. And that Google's not allowed to put their complementary products up above those of competitors, I think hasn't really benefited consumers. It's annoying for them. And of course, the check on doing that too much here in the US for Google is if Google was just shoving its preferences up there as search results and consumers didn't want it and didn't find it useful and didn't like it, they might consider a different search engine, right? They might consider DuckDuckGo or Bing or something else. But I don't think that's what's happening. I think that Google is pretty good at anticipating what we might find useful as the next step or two after that initial query. So in Europe, we see a lot of frustration about them coming in and saying, well, I know this is a really useful feature and it's free and you've been innovating it and making it better and better every iteration, but we really feel like that's unfair to the other guys who might have been a search result, if not for yours. Again, now you're serving a different master, right? Now you're serving competitors to Google's products, not the consumer, and the consumer ends up getting thrown under the bus. So we've seen that kind of frustration on a micro level with consumers in Europe. And on a macro level, I think two big indicators. One, in the US here, we can claim, depending on the day and what the stock market's doing, by market cap, we have about 7 or 8 of the top 10 global tech companies that we can claim. And I might not, and you might not, and everyone might not always agree with some of the decisions those tech companies make politically. I assure you, I can relate. But having those global tech leaders be U.S. companies with, at least the basic legal feelings and principles of U.S. companies is a huge advantage to the U.S. Domestically, it's an advantage because it's created so much wealth in people's 401ks, so many valuable services, so many innovations, so many jobs. But it's almost become kind of a matter of national security. We're in a race with China right now, and I don't want to see any of the tech companies on our team get hobbled. So that's one thing. Now, if you look over in Europe, how many of those top 10 are EU or UK companies? Not one. There's not one on the list. We're competing with a couple companies in various areas of Asia, but there's not anything. So, what do you get for letting the government meddle in these decisions about, there basically should be private business decisions and the market should give signals to customers like that or not. Like that's how things work. That's how things innovate and progress and improve. That's how wealth is created. The US has a light regulatory touch on tech and it's been a really amazing success. Whatever problems and challenges also have come up, overall, I think the benefits are undeniable. In Europe, not one. So, and the proof of that is now looking forward, not back, is artificial intelligence. A number of our big tech companies have refused to roll out their AI features, which they are offering here in the US, in Europe, because the regulatory uncertainty is so great. They don't want to subject themselves to another gazillion-dollar fine or, roll out a technology that months later they'll be deemed is illegal and you can't do that here. I think Europe is a big market for our tech companies and they don't want to take their ball and go home. And they also understand that if they want to operate there, they have to play by the law of the land. But I think when you make that law of the land impossible to work with, or at least uncertain enough to not be able to count, not to do a real analysis of like cost benefit of going there, you're starting to see sort of them not just talking the talk, but walking the walk and saying, well, we're not going to roll that out there because we don't know. Europe the EU went around bragging about how they were the first entity for AI regulations. And, I hope that still sounds crazy to the American ear. I hope that we're not looking to be a leader in regulation. I hope we're looking to be the leader in AI, because I can tell you who's not interested in anything other than being the leader when it comes to AI, and that's China. And, if Europe wants to hobble their own tech companies and sort of torture ours, I don't like it and I don't think it's a good idea. But the competition we're in with China is so important. I mean,
Well,
we
that's what I
have to
wanted to
be
ask
the
about too.
leader.
Outside of the EU, obviously China has to be a huge concern in regards to it. Are there other countries out there as well? But speak a little bit about their impact upon competition and antitrust.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously we have a different system of how, theirs is. I think saying industrial policy would be putting it lightly. They're to some extent driving these decisions and much more involved. And call me old fashioned, but my money is still on private sector innovation and entrepreneurship in America. But of course, because there really isn't the separation between private and public the way in China, the way there is here, those things get muddied. And so we just have to keep that in mind when we think about wanting the American tech industry to thrive. Again, I said it kind of approaches a national security concern because we really can't afford to fall behind and have China be the leader that's like setting international protocols and the first one there, right? There's some advantage in
Our,
those.
our tech industry is competing against both government and business in China.
Yeah, I think, yeah. So to me, Europe is a cautionary tale of how not to approach it. America so far has been an amazing success story. And again, I know there are challenges people have with some of these criticisms people have with some of these companies and there are challenges about, keeping our kids safe online and how much screen time is too much screen time for all of us of all ages. There's questions about social media's role around the election. There certainly are. Those things happen with every new technology, and I do believe that American society we can figure this stuff out and we can go forward. We can get on the learning curve, and it's going to be fine. But the race with China and AI is so important. Like I think maybe some Americans take for granted or have better things to think about. They're like working their jobs and raising their kids. So I'm here to tell you, we take for granted so much of what that tech leadership does for us. So much of the norms is set by America, and that's, I think, for the betterment of the whole world. And right now, there's a lot of smaller countries that are out there sort of looking around and saying, okay, who do we want to align with on our approach here? Is it going to be Europe and we're going to regulate it to death? Is it going to be America and we're going to go all in? Is it going to be China and be sort of government directed industrial policy? And, I'd really like for us to go a second round of tech innovation and show the world how it's done right. You just can't argue with where we've come out so far. Problems acknowledged, challenges acknowledged, but 7 or 8 of the top 10, that's pretty good. I mean, I think that's we don't need to change course. So part of that story is not growing antitrust to be like a de facto tech regulator in a way that is separated from sort of like common economic thinking on, what is antitrust, what should it be, where are its limitations. So, I think the concern that we have is that we're going to follow in the direction of the EU and not be able to compete against China, who's the real competition at this point.
So this has been a fascinating discussion on EU and China, and I want to bring it a little bit back onshore, and it may be a kind of a stark contrast to the light touch that you described relative to tech regulation, but talk about healthcare things. And obviously, antitrust and competition is such a pervasive issue; it's going to affect each industry sector very differently. When you look at highly regulated healthcare sector, which is a hodgepodge of both federal payers and regulations, as well as state payers, regulations, private sector payers. The last several years, and we can argue about when that's actually started, but we're seeing more and more vertical integration within healthcare. So the question I have for you relative to healthcare is, which came first, regulation or integration?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the healthcare industry has so much market distortion from so much government interference that it's really becomes a muddied question when you talk about the consolidation that we see, which surely is occurring, and isn't always showing, some amount of consolidation in some circumstances has real benefits, right? There's efficiencies, there's scale, there's all these good things can happen. But when that consolidation is sort of being unnaturally driven by government regulation, you might not see those benefits like you would see them if it happened organically in the marketplace. So I think the problem you have is that you have sort of a Frankenstein market, right? It's not really fully free market. It's not. It's kind of a mix of different things and competing incentives. And I think vertical integration out in the other economic sectors, you see the way that regulators look at it, they look at like, okay, well, what are all the benefits going to be? There's going to be, they call it the elimination of double margin. So if you have one less actor in there that has to make a profit, you can pass that savings on to consumers, and that can be a real benefit, as can be just better coordination and those sorts of things. So you do kind of a cost benefit of like, well, what are we giving up here and what are we gaining? And in the hospital sector, I think that people have become concerned that those benefits, they're not seeing those benefits. They're just kind of seeing less choice and less pressure on hospitals to lower prices. So, I just don't think, and I guess I will acknowledge the problem, but I don't think that antitrust is the solution. If you create circumstances where hospitals feel like they have to consolidate to survive, then you can't beat up on them for consolidating. Congress could lift the restrictions that are left over from the Affordable Care Act about Medicare and Medicaid payments to physician-owned hospitals. That puts those hospitals at an enormous disadvantage, that they're not able to get those payments. And then what do? Well, you try to scale up and combine. That might be, these are conjectures, but I think that might be driving some of the consolidation. I think the certificate of need stuff at the state level is something that could be addressed and looked at in a serious way. I think there's site neutral stuff about Medicare patient payments that might, and then there's also a conversation that I think is worth having about transparency of costs to patients from hospitals. Because if you don't know how much something costs, you're not going to go shop around. That could be healthy. I'm not a healthcare expert, but to my mind, when I look at this from a little bit of a distance, I think there's a lot of government regulation and mandates that are causing these distortions. And that might at least be a reasonable explanation for some of this consolidation.
Well, everyone talks about the we need more competition in healthcare, but I feel like it's a hard question to answer in a variety of ways. You did a real good job of giving us some tips about exactly how to go about looking at that and some tangible ideas. So thank you very much on that. You mentioned Congress, and I wanted to ask, is there much focus overall in regards to antitrust policy in the first branch, and do you expect any action there in this Congress or the next?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, we had a big flurry of activity. Senator Klobuchar and Cicilline in the House came out with a big congressional report that actually Lena Khan, who's now head of the FTC, was a committee staffer there, and she was, I think, very involved in that report. But there were a number of proposals put forth that kind of mimicked what we see from the EU, and they would kind of get moved out of committee, and oh my gosh, it's going to happen, and then it would never happen. So I think we've sort of backed up a little bit from the cliff of doing something truly harmful to antitrust law in the U.S. There'll always be enthusiasts for that in Congress, but and I'm certainly no election predictor, so who knows who's going to have control of what. But with the slim majorities we've seen lately, that sort of thing is even less likely. I think they kind of made their big run at it a couple Congresses ago and just weren't quite able to get it over the line. And we saw that fight shift then from Congress to the FTC and the DOJ, to the executive agencies, because they couldn't get it done in Congress, which is more concerning, right? Because I can certainly disagree with some of the decisions that Congress makes, but you know what? That's the process of our nation, and you have to respect that. If you can get it through Congress, then you win that one. They couldn't do that, and now we see, especially the DOJ is sort of patrolled by, they have to go into real Article 3 courts, so they can say whatever they want, but if a court doesn't buy it and it's not the law, then they're out of luck. But the FTC is sort of moving into these, I feel are extra constitutional areas of rulemaking. They're merger guidelines, which are just guidelines, but they are the set of instructions sent out to companies who want to merge, saying, okay, well, if you're this big or you have this much market share or this and that, you should probably be on watch that we might investigate your merger. They produced new merger guidelines at the FTC recently that are much, much more strict than the last couple of versions of merger guidelines. So they've kind of bypassed changing the law, and they're just seeing how much they can get done at the FTC in rulemaking and policy changes. Again, eventually that stuff ends up in an Article 3 court, but that's sort of where the fight has shifted off Congress, which is a more constitutional approach to getting your
So with
work
where
done.
we're at in our presidential race, I mean, obviously we've got two choices. If Congress stays as narrowly divided as what it's been, maybe there's not a lot of consensus there to be reached. Do you see much change, or what's the direction you see under either outcome there in regards to the presidential race?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. I'm not going to feel bad that I don't have a good answer for you, because the brightest minds working in tech have been running around at conferences trying to figure this out too. They don't know either. The strange setup is Kamala Harris, one might think would continue the direction of the Biden administration, but she's gotten a lot of pressure, has not responded. So who knows if it's worked or not, but she's gotten a lot of pressure from a couple big donors, Silicon Valley type donors, to back off this agenda. Again, no insight if she's taking that advice or not. And she, of course, is from California, where that sector is located. So some people who really love this new direction of antitrust are concerned that she's not going to keep up the fight. And then on the Trump side, former President Trump is a hard one to predict. A lot of these cases we see in court now, we're actually I would never try with that one. A lot of the cases we see in court right now were actually started during his administration, and he's obviously been a vocal critic of big tech. But then again, he's also kind of surprised everyone by coming out in defense of TikTok, being against the TikTok ban, which is something, TikTok, something he tried to ban by executive order while he was president. So he's certainly capable of reversing course in the tech space. But of course, JD Vance, another across the aisle big fan of Lena Khan's work and the antitrust work she's done against big tech, has lately come out and clarified that he's not always a big fan of her opposition to other mergers in other areas. But I think it's fair to say that no one knows, and we'll just have to see, what happens. And like you said, it all kind of depends too a little bit on what happens in the House and the Senate. So I don't think anyone has any crystal ball predictions, or if they do, I don't know. I wouldn't say them out loud.
Thank you so much for the insight, and totally agree in regards to that. It's very hard to predict the future these days. Last question. It's a little bit of a fun one, but if you were talking to your younger self graduating from Claremont McKenna College about a career in public policy, what's the best piece of advice that you'd share?
As important as it is to do the work and know your facts and do all that stuff, and it is, I would urge you to remain civil and kind to your fellow citizens, even when they don't agree with you, to not assign them, a bad motive, no name calling. The discourse in this town has really become rough. And DC's always been a rough town for politics. That's fair. But on the policy side, it's kind of gotten a little raw. And I think that it's important to remember that really decent, well-meaning people can disagree with you, and that's okay. And the only way to really win over the hearts and minds of people to your way of thinking is to persuade them with respect and kindness, not to make fools of them or berate them or call them names. That's not what we're doing here in the U.S., right? We've kind of all made this tacit agreement that we're going to agree on a few things, and then we're probably going to disagree on a lot of the other stuff, and we can get through that. So I guess I would say be kind even to people who disagree with you, be respectful, and we can it used to be in Washington, you could disagree all day at work and then you could go have dinner together. And I would love to see more people and young people coming up sort of adopt that as an option.
That is great advice and counsel, and very similar to what I would give the advice I'd give my younger self as well. Jessica, thank you so much for your time today. I want to thank our guests for joining us. If you're interested in hearing more from Jessica, we'll be posting follow-up links, including to her webpage at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. For those of you who have joined us, thank you for tuning in, and I hope that you found our discussion informative and beneficial. GovExperts exists to help facilitate substantive and serious discussions between and about the public and private sectors. If you liked this episode, we'd appreciate you sharing online and following GovExperts on LinkedIn, Facebook, and our other social media pages posted below. Thanks, and have a great day.
Thanks for joining this edition of GovExperts Insights. We invite you to follow this and other episodes at govexperts.com or on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and our other social media channels.